The Rotting Carcass Behind the Green Scare. How Anti-Civ Anarchy Became the Most Controversial Position by Zick. Green Anarchy and Red Anarchy, The Divide. Green Anarchy, regardless of the offshoot, is a philosophy, a critique, and a life way that emphasizes the most pronounced anarchist principles. Green anarchists are ready and willing to dismantle all structures of domination, starting with a deep-rooted analysis of ecology, which means the relationship between all living things and the physical environment we all depend on to survive. I'm going to examine the origins and gradual evolution of green anarchy, explore how these ideas are perceived by people out on the outside looking in, and try to understand why green anarchy is so detested by a contingent of bullheaded leftists who more and more have been slandering us as eco-fascists. Green anarchists take the critique of authority as far as it will go, not stubbornly stopping at government and capital as many anarchists will do, but going further to tackle all the hierarchical implications of work, industry, agriculture, patriarchy, society, gender norms, high technology, numbers, language, time, and more. It casts a wide net to identify and dissect all forms of oppression that spawn from the global industrial, agricultural, patriarchal, domesticating system that we are forced to live under. The contemporary forms of green anarchy, anti-civ green nihilism, and even the more PR-friendly but frustratingly wishy-washy post-civ have the same foundations and principles as anarcho-primitivism, but that label has largely been discarded by contemporary anarchists because of the racist implications of the white Western philosophers referring to diverse indigenous lifestyles as primitive. I used to call myself post-civ when in the company of leftists because, like a lot of green anarchists, I fell into the trap of trying to water down my anti-civ views to placate the scalding leftists that have long declared themselves the arbiters of sound anarchist theory. For years, Reds have stood up on a pedestal, loudly shaming, othering, and smearing anyone who isn't as enthusiastically devoted to the continued progress of the factory, the mine, the battery farm, the university campus, the cuticle, and other prisons as they are. It's natural not to want to be grouped in with villainous, problematic, dangerous element, and that's what anti-civ anarchy is largely presented as by a certain vocal elements within the left. An irredeemable boogeyman so frightening that it can't be allowed a voice, just in case the sound of it corrupts some impressionable child who doesn't know any better and is then turned away from centralization, coercion, ecological plunder, and imperialism that is inherent with industrial life. Red organizers have tried to forbid green anarchists from tabling at anarchist book fairs, overturned their tables when they showed up anyways, tried to confiscate their anti-civ literature, yelled at them, spat at them, pepper sprayed them, sucker punched them. Reds frothing at the mouth at the sight of green anarchists would almost be amusing if it weren't becoming so damaging to our health and physical safety. They've convinced themselves we're evil scum who want to seize their insulin, burn down their workplaces and cornfields, and most ridiculously, omnicide the human species. They believe all this because of the bald-faced lies they themselves made up to discredit anti-civ anarchy. There's a concerted effort on behalf of the left to project all the authoritarian constructs inherent with leftism onto anti-civ anarchy, which wants nothing to do with leftism or its towering pile of deadly and ecosystem-destroying failures. While humans and other animals suffer and die in staggering numbers all around us from the immediate effects of global industrial civilization, a lot of leftists swear up and down that anti-civ anarchists are the mortal threat to the continued survival of humanity, that we're a clear and present danger to civilized people's freedom. Let's try to unwrap why this is. First, I should explain what green anarchy is and what it isn't. Green anarchists theorize that generations of sedentary social stratification has led to human domestication. In the same way, dogs have been gradually domesticated from wild wolves. Just like with dogs, this domestication process has had the same cumulative detrimental effect on our physical and mental health and the way we interact with each other in our environment. It is proposed by green anarchists that a sustained rewilding process could act to curtail this domestication and restore the health of not only ourselves, but to balance our ecosystems. Some of the proposed ways to achieve this include regenerative land management techniques and the restoration of our social bonds with the biosphere. These correlative bonds we have had with our habitat for almost our entire existence as a species has become deeply fractured due to various alienating processes that brought about our domestication. Until these bonds are repaired and our planet's ecology is restored, we will continue to experience the dreadful effects of social and ecological collapse, as well as the continued processes of coercion and domination that are so ingrained in industrial mass society. Green anarchy addresses both social and environmental factors and understands that the two are interlinked in a holistic manner. If the ecosystem is broken, the people who live within it will continue to deteriorate until a healthy ecology is restored. Like all anarchists, we challenge all systems of authority and seek voluntary, mutual beneficial relationships with our neighbors in self-sustaining communities. The thing that most sets green anarchists apart from other tendencies is our dedication to extending our critique of domination to all life, not simply human life. We study anthropology and history to understand the origins of civilization and all the systems of domination that formed around it. The philosophy of green anarchy is informed by the writings and lifeway of transcendentalists, bioregionists, situationists, spiritual anarchists, anarcho-naturalists, indigenous anarchists, green nihilists, anti-civs, and anarcho-primitivists. These interrelated philosophies together form a strong critique of sociocracy, work, extractivism, social alienation, domestication, social stratification, technocracy, patriarchy, the division of labor / specialization, ableism, imperialism, institutional violence, desertification, mass society, ecocide, and all other forms of authority brought by the civilization that envelops the whole planet. There are those who are not willing to widen their critique of authority to most of these things, yet insist on identifying as bright green or eco-anarchists. These people are simply pushing insipid greenwash Marxism like Murray Bookchin made a career of doing for decades. Anyone working to convince us that the disastrous industrial system that's become so pervasive in our lives and driven so much of our planet's life to extinction can be gently reshaped into a peaceful ecological people's utopia has little understanding of what it means to be green and doesn't reject hypocrisy in a real way. Green anarchy embodies an unapologetic critique of all forms of authority. Solar punk, solar ecology, post-scarcity anarchism, and related attempts to appropriate the green label from anti-civs have no real desire to address the devastating consequences of the debilitating industrial system that rules us. Their wistful notions of green technology such as solar cells, undefined clean energy, and modular computing, 3D printers, and electric vehicles will solve this unprecedented crisis are incredibly short-sighted. They fail to understand just how destructive and polluting these high technologies are to extract from the earth, manufacture, and transport. They always fail to address the mountains of toxic waste that proceed during these processes and dumped in some third-world peasant's backyard. All of these high-tech goods require global supply chains chains extractivism, imperialism, and labor exploitation because they're made up of rare minerals and other resources that can only be sourced in certain parts of the world. The manufacturing process for microchips and silicones is so advanced that they require centralized mega factories that cost an absolute fortune to set up and run, which is why there are only 2 or 3 companies in the world with the required infrastructure. The microchip manufacturing process involves hundreds of steps and depends on advanced robots pushing tiny particles around massive fabrication facilities. The clean rooms inside these facilities require tightly controlled conditions with zero contaminations of dust, humidity, heat, or dirt. If one tiny imperfection enters the system, an entire batch will be ruined, costing a fortune and months of wasted preparation. You're not going to have a local neighborhood microchip factories like these solar punks seem to imagine. Reading an incredibly shallow and uninformed text like the Solar Punk Manifesto is an exercise in frustration for anybody who's thought seriously about the consequences of mass production and what it takes to maintain an industrial city. It reads like a child's proposal for saving the world. Look at some of these points. Solarpunk recognizes the historical influence politics and science fiction have had on each other. Solarpunk recognizes science fiction as not just entertainment, but as a form of activism. The visual aesthetics of solarpunk are open and evolving. As it stands, it's a mashup of the following: 1800s age of sail, frontier living, but with more bicycles, creative reuse of existing infrastructure, sometimes post-apocalyptic, sometimes present weird, appropriate technology, art nouveau, some random fucking names I'm not gonna read, innovation from the non-Western world, high-tech backends with simple, elegant outputs. In Solarpunk, we pulled back just enough in time to stop the slow destruction of our planet. We've learned to use science wisely for the betterment of our life conditions as a part of our planet. It's a silly, a style guide for drawing pretty art and writing fiction with certain aesthetic. It's a fun and creative pastime, sure, but it doesn't engage in any real way with the ongoing global ecocide beyond proposing green tech and without even attempting to explain how sustainable civilization. The more serious philosophies like Bookchin's social ecology and post-scarcity anarchism essentially make the same naive assumptions and proposals as solarpunk, but use bigger words to do it, while also repeatedly tarnishing anti-civs for not having enough faith in a futuristic science, technological progress, democracy, and workerism. I've written about Bookchin's greenwashed perceptions in a previous essay, so I won't rehash that here. The left's reductive utopian thinking insists on the dear leader's step-by-step plan for constructing a utopian worker society that has never led anywhere good. It's naive and damaging to imagine Leviathan can be tamed and reformed into serving the interests of free people. Industrial civilization will never allow left-wing technocrats to curtail its consistent expansion. The idea that the system can be reformed into compliance is a complete misunderstanding of powerocracy and how more pervasively a willing disregarding for the morbid reality we live every day. Leviathan has stolen both the present and the future from under us, and it's not going to suddenly play nice because some oblivious Bookchinites say that they can make it do their bidding. Prescribing a supposed lesser evil form to industrialism to solve the devastation brought on us by the industrial age is tragically inept. Leviathan will roll over these gullible solar industrialists and their green cities without skipping a beat. The The tireless drive of Leviathan to dominate absolutely everything everywhere and leave nothing but sand in its wake cannot be underestimated. Marxists completely fail to reckon with the coercion, domestication, alienation, domination, ecocide cycles that are inherent in industrial civilization. If someone told them capitalism could be reformed to benefit workers, they would laugh in their face, but somehow they're convinced Leviathan would be rendered docile and servile if workers possess more democracy in their workplace. They insist Leviathan's sprawling cities can be made peacefully coexist with the wilds that need to be stripped bare and burned to a crisp every record hot summer to maintain those cities. And all they need to do it, leftists in positions of power. It's patiently absurd, and yet they never question it because their entire ideological worldview depends on the glory of the moral leftist worker organizer who could do nothing wrong. They offer the same distorted solution to every problem. Just give workers democracy and everything will be okay. Because voter bodies will never use democracy to vote the future away to preserve their privileges. Coal miners would never vote to keep their mines open. Farm workers would never vote to use pesticides to make their jobs easier. Factory workers would never vote to outsource their industrial waste somewhere out of sight. Heavy use of sarcasm. Unlike anarcho-transhumanism, which took a pre-existing authoritarian-line school of thought from some rich white silicone executives and tried to fuse it with anarchy, with admittedly amusing results, there's no authoritarian primitivism. It's always been an anarchist school of thought. It envisioned by anarchists for anarchists as a critique of civilization and an associated living practice going all the way back to Theory, Taltari, Reckless, long before it was first given a name in the 1980s. The origins of anti-civ anarchy and other ecological movements. Ever since Theroux dropped out of society to live in the woods and document his experience in a diary, civilizational anarchy has been a strong current within the anarchist milieu. Living in balance with nature, practicing simple, sustainable survival skills in order to live without depending on other systems of authority, deconstructing the inherently alienating properties of industrial civilization, unlearning all the bad habits of urban life has indoctrinated us with. These were long-held anarchist principles, and it is only recently, thanks to self-avowed anti-anarchist crusaders like Murray Bookchin, that these ideas have been tarnished as lifestylist and reactionary. There have been a decades-long smear campaign led by anarcho-transhumanists, post-scarcity anarchists, and other Reds to equate anti-civ anarchy with eco-fascism and cast all anti-civs as transphobic, ableist, genocidal, wheelchair-stealing supervillains who work in the shadows to bring about the cruel destruction of everything civilized people hold dear. Green anarchy in its successive forms from transcendentalism to primitivism to the current trends of green nihilism and indigenous anarchism, has always rejected all authority, oppression, and domination. It's always been the anarchist school of thought most ready to pick apart every social institution to identify its limitations and its hierarchical inevitabilities, while other anarchist tendencies will have willfully ignored all manner of social hierarchies when people decide these hierarchies were beneficial to furthering the reductive ideological prescriptions to build bigger, better societies with cashy manufacturing jobs for everybody. The supposed divinity of progress has consumed the left since the dawn of the industrial age. Reclus summed it up well in 1905. Progress, in the strictest sense of the word, is meaningless, for the world is infinite in its unlimited vastness. One is always as distant from the beginning as from the end. The movement of society ultimately reduces the movements of the individuals who are its best consistive elements. In view of this fact, we must ask what progress in itself can be determined for each of these beings whose total lifespan from birth to death is only a few years. Is it no more than that of a spark of a light glancing off a pebble and vanishing instantly into the cold air? The missionaries who encounter magnificent savages moving around freely in their nakedness believe that they will bring them the progress by giving them dresses and shirts, shoes and hats, catechisms and Bibles, and by teaching them to chant the Psalms in English and Latin. And what triumphant songs in honor of progress have not been sung at the opening ceremonies of all industrial plants with their adjoining taverns and hospitals? Certainly, industry brought some real progress in its wake, but it is important to analyze scrupulously the details of this great evolution. The wretched populations of Lancashire and Somersetshire demonstrate that their histories were not a record of unadulterated progress. It is not enough to change one's circumstances and enter a new class in order to acquire a greater share of happiness. There are now millions of industrial workers, seamstresses, and servants who tearfully remember that the thatched cottages of their childhoods, and the outdoor dances under the ancestral tree, and the evening visits around the hearth. And what kind of progress is it for the people of the Cameroon and of the Tagu, who have henceforth the honor of being protected by the German flag, or for the Algerian Arabs to drink aperitifs and express themselves elegantly in Persian slang? In the spirit of Tao, green anarchy goes further than merely critiquing material structures of domestication and domination. It also critiques our concepts of what the world is, how we place ourselves in it, the purpose of self, and indeed the very idea of fixed reality. In the spirit of Tao, green anarchy goes further than merely critiquing material sources of domestication and domination. It also critiques our conceptions of what the world is, how we place ourselves in it, the purpose of self, and indeed the very idea of fixed reality. The way we conceive the world and of our existence on a metaphysical level is as important to green anarchist tradition as our understanding of the manufactured systems erected to dominate us. These systems restrain body and mind in order to maintain the constant forward march of civilization, keeping Leviathan fat and powerful and everything else in a state of perpetual spiritual starvation. Without a keen understanding of the self, the constraining logic of progress will forever linger in our minds and blunt all the provocative, stimulating possibilities we could be exploring, hindering us from living a life of joy rather than a tragic loop of suffering and sacrifice we've eternalized in service of Leviathan's monstrous appetite. Only by breaking down the imposing walls of domestication within our minds can we hope to truly progress beyond our compulsion to feed the glutinous serpent. There's a strong argument to be made that anti-civ is the most anti-authority of all the anarchist schools of thought, even going as far as critiquing language for its inherent alienation and propensity for hierarchy building, something that anyone with disabilities that cause communication struggles or with the common accent that marks them as poor for life would appreciate. This has a lot to do with why leftists are so quick to fearmonger and bad jacket anarchists when we have anti-civ ideas. The realization that green anarchists will go much, much further than they ever will in questioning the structures of domination that subjugate us must be incredibly threatening to people who crow about how radical and enlightened they are to anyone who will listen. So radical that they'll read anything David Graeber or Murray Bookchin ever wrote and will parrot their academic heroes' soothing telltales at every opportunity. If only the world could be as simple as they've conceived it in their manifestos. If only the workers owning the means of production could create a worldwide ecological utopia and all other forms of authority would evaporate when they met their singular goal. Then they wouldn't need to attack green anarchy and burn our books to prevent anyone from thinking beyond their ideal workplace fantasy. A lot of the anger about anti-civ anarchy demonstrably isn't actually about anti-civ anarchists at all, but at unrelated groups like individuals tending towards the wild, ITS, and deep green resistance, DGR. Reds associate these anti-anarchist groups with anti-civ anarchy for reasons only known to them. ITS is a Mexican terrorist group that may or may not be responsible for indiscriminate bombings and murders done in the name of eco-extremism and vengeance for the continuing deterioration of the planet's ecosystems. Among the attacks people identifying with ITS have claimed responsibility for are bombings of anarchist events and squads. Some of the random murders they've claimed in their communiques later turned out to have been committed by people with no connection to ITS, casting doubt on the virility of their claims. For example, murder victim Brian Osrio's boyfriend was arrested and tried for murder after the ITS communique tried to take credit for it. Regardless, they've written long tirades rejecting anarchism and celebrating bombing anarchist spaces. Equating this group with green anarchy doesn't make a lick of sense. DGR is a proudly trans-exclusionary millenarian organization that prescribes to hierarchical vanguardism in the form of a board of directors, submission to their dear leader and reactionary moralism as a solution for the destruction of the environment. Anarcho-primitivists John Zerzan, Kevin Tucker, and others have long criticized DGR's rigid hierarchy, their institutional transphobia, their cultish code of conduct that penalizes members for breaking with their rules, which include things as vague as disloyalty, lack of commitment, courage, or integrity. Their incredibly flawed historical understanding of revolution and radical history, and the cult of personality that surrounds the organization's leaders, Keith and Jensen. DGR really embody all the worst instincts of the historical authoritarian left, and equating this cultish top-down organization with any of the staunchly anti-left, anti-civ anarchist tendencies is ridiculous as blaming Kropotkin for Hitler or Mussolini's views simply because they were all big promoters of the progress of industrial society. The DGR organization, with its dogmatic manifestos that outline how the leaders of its vanguard will govern and punish its lesser members, is what you get when the left tries to tackle environmentalism. It really couldn't be any further removed from the principles of green anarchy. So when the left claims anti-civs are transphobic because of the views of DGR's creepy turf board of directors, they're really attacking the left's zealous organizationalism, the left's attempt at world building, the left's insistence on the ideological sameness among its members, and the left's stringent code of laws rather than anything green anarchy is responsible for. Leftists are striving to govern the people is the reason organizations like DGR are able to do harm, an institutionalized structural bigotry written in stone for all the members of a political organization to internalize and obey is far more dangerous than any isolated latent bigotry an anti-organizationalist like a green anarchist might hold. Bigotry is far more destructive when it has organized systematic power behind it. It's very telling that leftists can't or won't separate authoritarian environmental organizations that are organized according to leftist principles from the various anti-organizational green anarchist tendencies. Incoms are consistently insisting that they're the only real communalists, and that the only real leftists, the only real libertarians, and the only real Democrats. But when it comes to green anarchists, apparently we're all a bunch of eco-fascists. Eco-fascists, eco-extremists, DGR, ITS, and so on don't claim to be anarchists, primitivists, or any other variation of the two. The same goes for Ted Kaczynski, the former Unabomber, who doesn't claim to be an anarchist and in fact frequently lambasts anarchists and anarcho-primitivism for not being authoritarian like him. He calls anarcho-primitivism a romanticized vision and rejects it for being too socially progressive. For some reason, this man, who, if you've read his more recent writings, seems to most closely align with some form of class reductionist Maoism, but has been painted as the patron saint of anti-civ anarchy by people who clearly have no familiarity with his actual very vanguardist and governmentalist politics. While it is true some anti-civ anarchists have been influenced by a select few of his better ideas, that shouldn't be enough to weigh us down with all his bad ones. That being said, there are certainly some shit green anarchists out there, just like there are some shit red anarchists, orange anarchists, and so on. Anarchists should never be confused with some people who lay claim to the label, or we would have to abandon the anarchist philosophy because of the anarcho-capitalists. There are even some generally good anarchists who still maintain some good bad ideas, like certain aging anprims who can't manage to move past the old noble savage trope. There's also been some unacknowledgeable people who choose to identify with green anarchy without having much understanding of what anarchy entails. Some of these people feel alienated by industrial society, were drawn to vague anti-industrial politics, usually due to Kaczynski, and now loosely identify as green anarchists without having read enough about anarchy to realize how completely unforgiving it is when it comes to autocracy, domination, and oppression. They narrowly focus in on the anti-civ aspects of anarchy, which really have very little use without the broader anti-authoritarian aspects. Just like baby red anarchists, baby green anarchists will soon either switch to a less demanding philosophy when realizing how high the learning curve is, or will in some time develop into decent anarchists. The reason properly informed green anarchists don't aim to construct a program to focus our principles on the world is because we fully believe in anarchy. Coercing people to live in the way that we live would instantly disqualify us from being anarchists. Most of the smears against green anarchists seem to come from the discomfort provoked by random violence committed by Kaczynski or ITS or the transphobia of DGR, even though all three have vocally denounced green anarchy on multiple occasions. The idea that hierarchical organizations and terrorists who vocally oppose green anarchists somehow represent green anarchy is absurdly disingenuous, even for the left. It really needs to be said again and again and again until it seeps into the collective consciousness. Anti-civ anarchy is a critical framework. It is not a political program for building a new world order. It is not a plan to build a global hunter-gatherer society or to force any way of life on anyone. It's a useful lens that we can apply to problems that are then tackled on a case-by-case basis by people most affected by them. It's not a system for ordering reductive prescriptions on everything, everyone, and everywhere. John Moore said, "There's always the danger, as witnessed recently in the Fifth Estate, for example, where hostile commentators will twist your words so that it looks like you are constructing a primitivist ideology and setting up a primitivist political movement, even when you state exactly the contrary. We're not going to seize anyone's insulin, break their wheelchair, or ban them from playing video games. The reason this slanderous myth is so pervasive among leftists is because leftists assume every school of thought is like their own, a program to force their ideological blueprint on for the organization of people on the world. A rigid and unchanging manifesto that claims to have all the answers to all our conundrums. They don't seem able to convince or to conceive of a non-prescriptive worldview because their worldview so revolves around a long-dead German or Russian man's promise to solve all the world's problems with his immortal communist science. While the left revolves around a few learned men manufacturing system and rules for others to live by, anti-civ has no such ambitions. The majority of criticisms leftists have about green anarchy are them projecting their own grand ambitions for the ordering of society onto anti-civ anarchists. They're unwilling to break out of their ever-shrinking ideological bubble to understand the difference between a critical framework and a political program. They can't fathom of a philosophy that isn't yet another tired prescription for world building and people management. This becomes extremely clear when the first thing Reds ask us when they hear we're green anarchists is almost always, "So what does your utopia look like?" This binary way of thinking makes it near impossible to communicate our ideas to them without them making 100 false assumptions fed to them by their own ideological brainworms. The fierce cognitive dissonance that erupts in leftists when green anarchists are willing to poke holes in all their hierarchical systems they aren't willing to dismantle betrays their small-minded thinking. They simply lack the imagination to think outside of the suffocating concrete box they've constructed for themselves. Post-civ, leftist drift. While much of the fallacious green scare leftists have stirred up comes from them confusing green anarchy for authoritarian environmentalist movements, as well as the rampant badjacketing Bookchin unleashed against green anarchists to help prop up his greenwashed political program. There's also a green anarchist tendency that seems to only exist because of that same green scare, post-civ anarchy. This tendency, while being anarchist and anti-civ, still manages to feed the big lie that other forms of green anarchy are deviant and bigoted ideas that we need to loudly castigate and distance ourselves from at every opportunity. It represents that tiresome myth that primitivism is a political program to remake society in the image of indigenous hunter-gatherers and subsistence farmers. The same way that communalism is a program to remake society in the image of the collectively owned factor worker. These are the points Margaret Killjoy makes in setting post-civ apart from anarcho-primitivism. Let's go through them one by one, and I'll demonstrate how they're little more than straw men, and show that post-civ is really no different than anarcho-primitivism in substance and practice, and then attempt to distance green anarchy from its roots necessitates buying into the smears disseminated by transhumanists, Marxists, and others who fetishize the idea of liberation through the progress of industrial civilization. Killjoy begins, "We're not primitivists. It is neither possible nor desirable to return to a pre-civilized state of being. Most of the groundwork of anti-civilization thought, important work, mind you, has been laid down by primitivists. Primitivists believe, by and large, that humanity would be better served by returning to a pre-civilized way of life. This is not a view we share. Imprims don't actually believe it's possible or desirable to, quote, return to a pre-civilized state of being, end quote. So from the get-go, Killjoy is building a coercive straw man. The definitive explainer for an anarcho-primitivism and green anarchy in general still remains a primitivist premiere by the late John Moore, who was my creative writing professor when I was an international student in England in the early 2000s, coincidentally. Everyone who wants to understand the anti-civ philosophy should read this text because it will quickly dispel the myths being put out into the world by fearful blockheads. From a primitivist premiere. The aim is not to replicate or return to the primitive, merely to see the primitive as a source for inspiration, as exemplifying forms of anarchy. For anarcho-primitivists, civilization is the overarching context within which the multiplicity of power relations develop. Some basic power relations are present in primitive societies, and this is one reason why anarcho-primitivists do not seek to replicate those societies. But it is in civilization that power relations become pervasive and entrenched in practically all aspects of human life and human relations with the biosphere. The fact is that anarcho-primitivism is not a power-seeking ideology. It does not seek to capture the state, take over the factories, win converts, create political organizations, or order people about. Instead, it wants people to become free individuals living in free communities which are interdependent with one another with the biosphere that they inhabit. It wants, then, a total transformation, a transformation of identity, ways of life, ways of being, and ways of communicating. This means that the tried and tested means of power-seeking ideology just aren't relevant to the anarcho-primitivist project, which seeks to abolish all forms of power. So new forms of action and being, forms appropriate to and commensurate with the anarcho-primitivist project, need to be developed. This is an ongoing process, so there is no easy answer to the question, what is to be done? At present, many agree that communities of resistance are an important element of the anarcho-primitivist project. The word community is bandied about these days in all kinds of absurd ways, i.g. the business community. Precisely because most genuine communities have been destroyed by capital and the state. Some think that traditional communities, frequently sources of resistance to power, have been destroyed, and then the creation of communities of resistance, communities formed by individuals with resistance as their common focus, are the way to recreate bases of action. An old anarchist idea is that the new world must be created within the shell of the old. This means that when civilization collapses through its own volition, through our efforts, or a combination of the two, there will be an alternative waiting to take its place. This is really necessary, as in the absence of positive alternatives, the social disruption caused by the collapse could easily create the psychological insecurity and social vacuum in which fascism and totalitarian dictatorships could flourish. For the present writer, this means that anarcho-primitivists need to develop communities of resistance, microcosms, as much as they can be, of the future to come, both in cities and outside. These need to act as bases of action, particularly direct action, but also as sites of creation for new ways of thinking, behaving, communicating, being, and so on, as well as new sets of ethics. In short, a whole new libertarian culture. They need to become places where people can discover their true desires and pleasures, and through the old good anarchist idea of explanatory deed, show others by example that alternative ways of life are possible. However, there are still many possibilities that need exploring. The kind of world envisaged by anarcho-primitivism is one unprecedented in human experience in terms of the degree and types of freedom anticipated, so there can't be any limits on the forms of resistance and insurgency that might develop. The kind of vast transformations envisaged will need all kinds of innovative thought and activity. So, primitivism is not an attempt to turn back the clock to the Stone Age, as Killjoy asserts. It's rather taking action to set up alternative, sustainable, and thriving ways of life for the purposes of prefiguration. It's looking forward to create forms of resistance, setting up living refuges parallel to industrial society to house free people, and putting together the infrastructure anarchists need to thrive within the shell of the rapidly collapsing civilization. The anti-civ philosophy is a guide that we can use to prepare ourselves for the deluge of natural disasters, pandemics, famines, and droughts. This decaying civilization will continue to rain down on us and give us the fortitude to help each other not only survive these catastrophes, but prosper in the ruins of the old world as it decays all around us. Rather than being an action to return to a society of the past, it is a concerted effort to look to the future and to create sobering but necessary mechanisms to cope with our continuing decay of civilization. Civilization will continue to collapse due to its universal instability, destructive and non-regenerative properties. It is not helpful to ignore or deny this simple reality just because it threatens the reductive idea leftists have of technological progress and democracy being the solution to everything. Killjoy then claims, primitivists reject technology. We must reject the inappropriate use of technology. Now, to be fair, that's almost all of the uses of technology we see in the civilized world. But our issue with most primitivist theory is that one of babies in bathwater. Sure, most technologies are put to rather evil uses, whether warfare or simple ecocide, but that doesn't make technology, the application of scientific knowledge and practical purposes, inherently evil. It just means that we need to completely reimagine how we interact with machines. With tools, even with science, we need to determine whether something is useful or sustainable, rather than judging things purely on its economic or military value. A related text that was presumed authored by Killjoy under the pseudonym goes into more detail about the post-civ view of technology. Another absurd proposition that primitivists stand behind is that tools and technology are inherently oppressive, and that we should therefore abandon them. While many of these tools and technologies can be applied in oppressive ways, there is nothing ingrained in tools or the development of technologies that makes them oppressive. It seems especially foolish for a primitivist to argue that this position, when the society they advocate returning to is replete with tools and technologies: spears, bows, arrows, stone axes, obsidian knives, cordage, hand drill fires, pottery, totem carving, body modification, jewelry, basketry, hide tanning. These are all tools and technologies employed by primitive societies. Primitivists advocate learning these skills as part of a rewilding ourselves in our world, and yet they continue to denounce tools and technologies. Seem a little hypocritical, doesn't it? These points most obtuse of all because they're completely misrepresenting the anarcho-primitivist definition of technology and the distinction often made between high and low technology. And prims don't reject any of these things listed in the above quote. It's purely a straw man to pretend otherwise. From an anarchist premiere again, which I'll again stress everyone should read in its entirety. John Zerzan defines technology as assemblage of division of labor, production, industrialism, and its impact on us and on nature. Technology is the sum of mediations between us and the natural world, and the sum of these separations mediating us from each other. It is all drudging. It is all the drudgery and toxicity required to produce and reproduce the stage of hyper alienation we languish in. It is the texture and the form of domination that gives any stage of hypocrisy and domination. Opposition to technology thus plays an important role in the anarcho-primitivist practice. However, Freddie Perlman says that technology is nothing but the Leviathan's armory, its claws and fangs. Anarcho-primitivists are thus opposed to technology, but there is some debate on how central technology is to domination and civilization. A distinction should be made between tools or implements and technology. Perlman shows that primitive peoples developed all kinds of tools and implements, but not technologies. The material objects, the canes and canoes, the digging sticks and walls, were things a single individual could make, or they were things like a wall that required the cooperation of many on a single occasion. Most of these implements are ancient, and the material surpluses these implements supposedly made possible have been ripe since the first dawn, but they did not give rise to impersonal institutions. People, living beings, give rise to both. Tools are creations on a localized small scale, the products of either individuals or small groups on specific occasions. As such, they do not give rise to systems of control and coercion. Technology, on the other hand, is the product of large-scale interlocking systems of extraction, production, distribution, and consumption. And such systems gain their own momentum and dynamic. As such, they demand structures of control and obedience on mass scale, what Perlman calls impersonal institutions. As you can see, imprims, while having no qualms with what Killjoy would call useful and sustainable, i.e. items that don't require large-scale interlocking systems of extraction and production, distribution and consumption. Killjoy even admits to rejecting almost all of the uses of technology we see in the civilized world. So what post-civs propose is really exactly the same as what imprims propose. Tools that can be produced locally without hypocrisy, control, coercion, or obedience, and without centralized extractive imperialist resource pillaging supply chains that require to run industrial society. This is not defined as technology by imprims. Locally produced, sustainable tools that improve our lives without destroying our biosphere are fully embraced by anarcho-primitivist philosophers, just as they are by Killjoy's post-civ manifesto. If you prefer, it's the difference between low-tech, useful and sustainable, and high-tech, alienating and destructive. Killjoy continues. Primitivists reject agriculture. We simply reject monoculture, which is an inherent, apparent and centralizing, destroys regional autonomy, forces globalization on the world, and leads to horrific practices like slash and burn farming. We also reject the other stupid ideas of how to feed humanity, like setting 6 billion people loose in the woods to hunt and gather. By and large, post-civ folks embrace permaculture, agricultural systems designed from the outset to be sustainable in whatever given area they are developed. Again, they're strawmanning in-prim philosophy by claiming in-prims want to force 6 billion people to be hunter-gatherers. In-prims are not trying to enforce an inflexible collectivist authoritarian social program on anyone, let alone the entire planet. Imprims are simply engaged in expansive criticism of industrial society, while exploring all other possible alternatives to it and experimenting with those alternatives in their own lives. These alternatives are being discussed almost always include producing food in some manner due to the simple reality that there's very little wildness left in the world to forage from. All the anti-civs I know grow a majority of their food and supplement their diets with some foraged food, which isn't adherent enough to live on exclusively due to the march of climate change, the rise of wildfires, and agriculture and industrial land clearing. Imprims especially talk favorably of the long history of indigenous peoples deliberately attending rainforests to encourage the proliferation of useful nourishing plants, which is an example of horticulture that isn't extractive, non-renewable, and destructive. Imprims fully embrace the re-establishment of Earth's food forests, which will require a concerted human effort to replant and cultivate. This is how Zerzan describes agriculture. 1. Agriculture is the will to power over nature, the materialization of alienated humanity's desire to subdue and control the natural world. 2. Agriculture inevitably destroys the balance of nature, leaving biological degradation and ecological ruin in its wake. 3. Agriculture is the beginning of work and production, generating an increasingly standardized, confined and repressive culture. And 4. Agriculture leads inevitably to the rise of civilization. What is being described here is precisely what Killjoy calls monoculture. Killjoy then borrows a non-anarchist phrase, permaculture, without defining it, but permaculture and food forests are incredibly similar concepts. Permaculture is an approach to land management and settlement design that adopts arrangement observed in flourishing natural ecosystems. It includes a set of design principles derived using whole system thinking. It applies these principles in fields such as regenerative agriculture, town planning, rewilding, and community resilience. Food forests. A food forest, or a forest garden, is a garden that mimics the structures of a natural forest with multiple layers of plants stacked vertically to increase the overall production. As you can see, food forests and permaculture are closely related concepts, with the only real difference being that permaculture is a copyrighted brand used to generate profit by a handful of affluent white settlers who write guides, teach courses, and sell permaculture certificates to the public, while also embodying the white male guru culture. Food forests, for all intents and purposes, are simply the free and open source version of the proprietary for-profit, needlessly complicated permaculture program without the misogynistic, capitalistic personality cult permaculture's bogged down with. Killjoy goes on. Primitivists have done a good job at exploring the problems of civilization, and for this we commend them, but on a whole their critique is unnuanced. Strong words, considering anarcho-primitivists have written troves and troves of theory that deconstructs every form of authority that arises from the industrial world, while post-civ is nothing more than 3 short blog posts filled with straw man attacks seemingly informed by silly memes made by leftists on Reddit and Twitter. Leftists flood anarchist spaces with these anti-premi memes, most famously the Return to Monkey one, to further their Green Scare program, which allows them to continue pushing their 19th century workerist prescriptions to the catastrophic 21st century problems, successive ecological and social collapse, that these prescriptions have helped us lead to. Killjoy continues. The societal structure they envision, tribalism, has been socially conservative. What many tribes lack in codified law, they made up for with rigid customs, and one generation is born into the near exact way of their predecessors. Again, anarcho-primitivist willingness to explore and analyze various indigenous tribes and bands, both living and dead, and engage with these cultures to outline how they differ from the industrial model and how they avoided destroying their natural environment is not the same as the intention to enforce an ideological program on people. It's not a world-building exercise. It's not a government. It's not a set of customs or an attempt to impose a tribal system on the world. There's nothing wrong with learning from indigenous cultures and adapting their methods in your own life, especially the anarchistic ones. She also falls into the trap of talking about indigenous people in the past tense, as if these lifeways are extinct, when indigenous cultures continue to thrive all over the world. A white settler presenting diverse indigenous people as conservative in order to dismiss and sneer at them is concerning. But it's especially frustrating to see an anarchist mar indigenous people for being born into the same way of life enjoyed by their predecessors. Is Killjoy under the impression life in whatever dreary U.S. suburb she inhabits is unique from her parents' dreary suburban existence? If life under the crumbling industrial order has so much potential for freedom compared to life in the wilds, why is she post-civ? Why not embrace civilization and all the freedoms, experiences, and opportunities for growth it supposedly offers? Killjoy concludes, "We cannot, en masse, return to a pre-civilized way of life, and honestly, most of us don't want to. We refuse a blanket rejection of everything that civilization has brought us. We need to look forwards, not backwards." Killjoy is embracing anarcho-primitivism as it's described in all the notable imprims of the 20th century and the anti-civs of today, while rejecting the imaginary vision of anarcho-primitivism built by leftist internet trolls. She wraps it up with this line, "We are not primitivists." That's fine and dandy, and I'm also a green anarchist that doesn't identify as primitivist. But Killjoy really hasn't explained how post-civ differs in any substantial ways from anarcho-primitivism. The only possible divergencies from primitivism I can identify in their post-civ explainer are: 1. The proposal of proprietary permaculture courses created by white settlers in Australia instead of the indigenous food forest permaculture was inspired by, and 2. The way they say they're open to theoretical, sustainable, non-extractive, non-polluting technologies that are really no different from the locally produced life-thriving tools imprims readily embrace in theory and practice. Killjoy is simply using different language than primitivists to obfuscate the reality that post-civ are really critical of destructive technologies which rely on global supply chains, as any Gardner Verity primitivist is. None of the points Killjoy makes to set post-civ apart from primitivists stand up to any kind of scrutiny. The attempt to rebrand anti-civ to post-civ so it can escape its completely unearned reputation has only helped feed the big lie that anti-civ anarchy is omnicidal, ableist, transphobic, fascist death cult that needs to be struggled against, and no platformed by the endless stream of performative anti-fascist Twitter activists. It only serves to fuel the left's green scare. The rise of the Antifa gang. The last ingredient in the left's multifaceted green scare campaign comes from the gradual cooperation of green anarchy by liberal, quote, anti-fascist activists, end quote, who have no real understanding of anarchy, but glue themselves to anarchist discourse nonetheless. The most famous case of this is the man who will now forever be known as Special Agent Alexander Reed Ross, a prolific writer for liberal websites, i.e., The Daily Beast, and a staunch anti-primitivist voice. Ross dedicated years of his life to associating green anarchy and ecological views in general with white supremacy and fascism. In his trite, the disinformation-filled essays about the fascist creep, he drew a straight line from ecological movements to white supremacy, claiming they were one and the same. He spent a lot of energy looking for fascism under every rock while working to cancel all of his ideological enemies, often by inventing malicious lies and strained half-truths to wrongfully associate them with fascism. This has, of course, only resulted in sustained diminishing of the anti-fascist tradition as these liberal activists hijack what was once a fiercely radical practice to target various anarchists and anti-imperialists who don't fall in line with their left liberal program. For a long time, Ross had great success stirring up anti-green sentiment in anarchist and socialist spaces. That all came to a halt recently when he was outed as being on the bankroll of far-right billionaire, and I dare say fascist, Charles Koch? Yes, really. Ross is a senior researcher, end quote, in a team that also includes the former heads of the CIA and DHS departments, former cops and Republican politicians. This quote-unquote think tank and the Network Contagion Research Institute is directly payrolled by the Charles Koch Foundation and similar far-right deep state entities working to further the advance of industrialism, capitalism, and imperialism. Fox now seems to be hiding as left publications scrub his disinformation-filled articles from their archives and issue apologies for publishing them in the first place. Another leftist personality seemingly working from the COINTELPRO playbook is Ross's good friend William Gillis, an anarcho-transhumanist Twitter personality who has written similar scathing screeds against green anarchy and recently tried and failed to mount a vicious whisper campaign against indigenous nihilist and anti-civ anarchist Aragon. I should mention that Aragon published my book when no red anarchist publisher ever would talk to me. Even a few months after Aragon tragically died, Gillis tried to claim he was a serial rapist, and as evidence presented an old interview where Aragon said that he slept around when he was a teenager. Fortunately, no one took the bait, and Gillis slithered back to the safety of his Twitter. These reactionary left liberals in anarchist garb are unfortunately all too welcome in most anarchist spaces, and they dedicate countless hours to mounting toxic struggle sessions against their ideological enemies, who are often green, indigenous, black, and anti-left anarchists. Through these green scare crusaders are most exclusively white North American men with high-paying jobs in academia or the tech sector. They work tirelessly to harness the identity of actually marginalized people to use as weapons in their tedious war against anyone who has strayed too far from the threadbare leftist program. They present themselves as morally pure knights in shining armor, sent by Murray's ghost to cleanse anarchist spaces of the green menace, to preserve the forward momentum of Western civilization, to safeguard progress, democracy, and the Western way of life. Their sworn mission statement is to save poor, innocent, marginalized people from the cold, cruel clutches of green anarchy, but their allegiances to this performative social justice dance crumbles to pieces when they react to the indigenous ways of life that are such an integral part of green anarchist philosophy. They speak of indigenous lifeways as with barely restrained disgust. To them, anything and anyone that isn't wholly dedicated to preserving the industrial monolith is dirty, backwards, and savage. Their tireless struggle to punish and purge anyone who dares to think beyond the realm of ponderous and feeble leftist solutions is the biggest hindrance to the development of the beautiful idea. The left insists on controlling all radical discourse so their prescriptions and programs and self-destructive domineering behaviors are never challenged, allowed no alternatives to Marx and Kropotkin's 19th century industrial idealism, pushing us all back into the dark, damp rooms, the walls lined with moldy red books. They lock the door and barricade it. The left works so hard to hold us down, to shackle us with their stale 19th century nostalgia because they know that this is the only place they have power over us. This dark room with peeling red walls that only they have the key to. Decades after killing it, Leviathan continues to hungrily feed on this fat, writhing carcass. The sooner anarchists completely detach ourselves from the festering remains of the left, the sooner we can stop being weighed down by the brilliantly irrational superstitions that are the basis of their reactionary Green Scare campaigns.